Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a legal case that, honestly, is pretty wild. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward murder conviction. But when you start to peel back the layers, wow, it really makes you question everything. So, how in the world does a conviction for murder, one that ends with a death sentence, get completely tossed out? That's the big question we're tackling. We're going to walk through this real-life court judgment to see how a case that looked absolutely airtight it completely fell apart under scrutiny. So let's start with the outcome, because it's a real shocker. The whole thing kicked off with a fatal shooting, stemming from a tragic marriage dispute. But how it all ended up in court, nobody saw that coming.
So at the initial trial, the court came down hard. Mohammed Atif Naveed was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. The other man, Mohammed Ishfaq, got 10 years for attempted murder. I mean, with penalties this severe, you'd think the case was completely closed.
But then, the appeal. And this is where it gets crazy. The higher court? They acquitted both of them. Just like that. Convictions and sentences gone. So the big question is, how? How do you go from a death sentence to walking free? To figure that out, we've got to dig into how the prosecution built their case in the first place. Okay, so Section 2, cracks in the timeline. The appeals court went right back to the beginning. They looked at the very first hours of the investigation and, yikes, they found some major red flags right away.
Okay, so look at the sequence of events. The shooting happens at 4:30 p.m. The victims get to the hospital a little over an hour later. The official complaint is supposedly written down at 6:55 p.m. The prosecution claimed the police report was filed promptly, but the court, they weren't buying it. They suspected it was actually filed much, much later and then backdated.
And this is the real kicker. If the cops really had the full story from the complainant at 6:55 p.m., like they claimed, then why was the official report they gave the medical examiner for the autopsy almost completely blank? Seriously, it should have had the basic facts of the crime, right? But it had nothing about who the attackers were, what weapons were used. It didn't even mention that a second person was injured. That just doesn't add up.
And the court's judgment puts it perfectly. They basically said, look, all these missing details lead to one inescapable conclusion. The police had no idea who the killers were until after the post-mortem was done. Think about what that means. It suggests the witnesses had time to get their stories straight after they knew the medical details. That's a massive problem.
All right, next up, unreliable eyewitnesses. With the timeline already looking shaky, the court turns to the people who claimed they saw it all. The prosecution's entire case really hung on two people. But, and this is a big but, their testimonies were just full of holes. Let's talk about eyewitness number 1. This was the wife of the man who was killed. She survived the attack, but she was also shot. I mean, you'd think her testimony would be the strongest piece of evidence, right? She was literally there. 12 days. That's how long the police waited to take her official statement. 12. The court looked at that and said, hold on a second. That is a very long time, and the prosecution had no good reason for it. It just felt off. So the prosecution tried to explain it away. They said, she was medically unfit to speak. But that excuse just didn't hold water. Why? Well, for one, the doctor who saw her on day 1 said she was conscious and oriented. Then, she was actually sent home from the hospital on day 8, but the police still waited another 4 days to talk to her. The court saw this as a huge red flag. Okay, so what about eyewitness number 2? This was the brother of the deceased. He's the one who filed the complaint, and his story was that he was right there, following them on his motorcycle, and saw the whole thing go down. But when the court started asking questions, his story started to fall apart. First off, he couldn't even describe the motorcycle he was supposedly riding. Then, he couldn't explain what happened to it after the shooting. Weird, right? And his version of who was in the car that took the victims to the hospital was totally different from the other witnesses' version. And here's the real head-scratcher. He admitted he had a phone on him, but never once called for help. The court called that behavior completely unnatural. And it gets even worse for the prosecution. This brings us to Section 4, evidence in conflict. It wasn't just that the timeline was weird and the witnesses were unreliable. The physical scientific evidence, it actually clashed directly with what the eyewitnesses claimed they saw. So remember the brother? He testified that the fatal shot was fired from super close, like just 2.5 feet away. But the medical evidence told a completely different story. The autopsy report was clear.
There was no gunpowder residue, no blackening, no charring around the wound. At that close range, there absolutely should have been. The science just didn't back up the story.
And this is such a key point in the law. The court says it right here. When what a witness says doesn't match the medical evidence, it creates doubt. And the benefit of that doubt, well, it can't be taken away from the accused. It's a fundamental rule. When a story doesn't match the science, you have a problem.
And this all leads us to the final section, the principle of doubt. So when you add it all up, the sketchy timeline, the questionable witnesses, the evidence that just doesn't line up, you get to the only logical conclusion the court could make.
The whole case boils down to this fundamental idea in criminal law, the benefit of the doubt. And it's so important to get this right. It doesn't mean the court decided the defendants were innocent. What it means is that the prosecution completely failed to prove they were guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Let's just recap the doubts really quick. Step 1. The investigation's timeline was suspicious from the get-go. Step 2. The main witness's testimony was delayed and just felt unreliable. Step 3. The second witness's story was contradictory and, frankly, unbelievable. And Step 4. The physical evidence flat out contradicted what the eyewitness said. Every single part of the prosecution's case had a massive crack in it.
And the court leaned on another powerful legal principle, which basically says this: if the facts can be interpreted in two different ways, you have to choose the one that favors the accused. In this case, for almost every piece of evidence, you could see it in a way that created doubt, and when that happens, the law is clear. So what happens when the very foundations of a case are built on doubt? That's really the question here, isn't it? This story wasn't about the defendants proving they were innocent. It was about the prosecution failing badly to prove they were guilty. And it's such a powerful reminder that in any justice system worth its salt, the process, how you build a case, is every bit as important as the final outcome.